Hello, 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 my beautiful, beautiful wildflowers. It is so good to see you today, and I hope you are doing very well. So today, I am back with another true crime case, and it has been a while, but I'm excited to cover this topic. This is the case of the Freeway Phantom from the 1970s, and I'll get into that in a moment, but if you like this video, please be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons and to leave a comment down below so we can talk. It feels weird doing this in a soft-spoken voice instead of whispering, because I always whisper, but I hope you can appreciate it. I hope it sounds good. So, I will also say that this is a true crime case, and you might find it upsetting, and I would definitely give this a 16 plus age reading. So that being said, and if you don't really like the combination of ASMR and true crime, please just go watch one of my other videos. I know it's not for everyone. So I will be referring to this case from this book called Cold Cases. I blasted through this book in like 2 days. I loved it. And if you're a true crime junkie like me, you might recognize the Black Dahlia here on the cover. And what I like about this book is that there are a good variety of cases. Some you have probably heard of before, like the Black Dahlia, the Zodiac Killer, the Golden State Killer, but there are also ones that other people have not heard of before. One of them being the Freeway Phantom, at least I had not heard of before. But this is a horrifying and, I think, telling story about the flaws in our criminal justice system and racism. So I'm going to skip the first part because it's it's an unrelated topic, and it's just very graphic. So I'm going to skip the very first part, but I will begin with how the author segues into the actual case. This might take a while. I will try to read the whole chapter, so get ready. So, some victims matter more than others. Unlike the case of Brock Turner, there was no media storm in the 1970s when 6 young girls were murdered in the DC area. Sure, it did get publicity. It was in the newspapers. The murderer got a nickname, the Freeway Phantom. There was at one time a reward for information leading to an arrest, but the $9,000 isn't as much as some might think for so many murders of young children over the span of about 17 months. But what's even more puzzling about the case is that, unlike a lot of similarly situated serial killers of the 1970s, sometimes called the golden era of serial killers, including Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, and so forth, the Freeway Phantom has left little lasting notoriety outside of Washington, D.C. Most people, even some ardent true crime enthusiasts, are unfamiliar with the case. How does that happen? How does someone murder 6 young girls and get forgotten? There are several arguments, one being that it just wasn't clear at the time if law enforcement was dealing with a serial killer or not. But the most obvious one, particularly with today's hindsight, and the one that was felt most deeply by the family members left behind, is that it's because the victims were black. The murders began in April of 1971 with 7th grader Carol Denise Spinks. She was a small girl with medium-length dark hair and eyes that looked like they'd grow wise someday, but in her class picture her eyes are just kind and waiting for fun. She was 13 years old and experiencing those "I'm a teenager now" feelings that most kids get. Carol wanted more freedom. So when her older sister sent her to the 7-Eleven a half-mile away for TV dinners and some other items, she was happy to go. It was around 7:00 p.m., but the sun wasn't down yet. It seemed like she had plenty of time to go and come back before it got dark. Carol passed her mother on the way to the store. Her mom told her she wasn't supposed to be out by herself, but she let her continue on to the store. Her mom told her to come straight home, but she never did. Instead, Carol went missing for a week before an 11-year-old boy found her body on May 1st. Carol's body was discovered near the Suitland Parkway by Interstate 295. She'd been strangled and sexually assaulted. Her shoes were missing. That's about as graphic as I'll try to get here. She'd been dead 2 or 3 days, but no one knew what had happened or where she was in the days between when she went missing and her death. The next horrific murder of a young girl in the D.C. area had all the markings of the slayer that would become known as the Freeway Phantom. For months, police and the media included Angela Denise Barnes, on the list of the Phantom's victims, but she wasn't. Angela, like Carol, had Denise in her name. And by the time people started to pay attention to the case, there were 2 other girls with Denise in their names. Some of the news outlets that reprinted that Associated Press article jumped on this, but police were never able to make heads or tails over whether it really mattered or not. I don't know, that's a crazy coincidence to me. I don't know about you. Angela was 14 years old. She was found shot in the head 2 days after Carol's body was found. She'd attempted to walk home from a friend's house just before midnight on July 12, 1971, but never made it. Angela's body was also found along a highway, less than an hour's drive from Carol's body. Angela was discovered along the Maryland State Highway 228, which forks off of Highway 295, 25 miles south of Washington, D.C. Despite some glaring differences in the 2 cases, method of murder being the big one, Angela was assumed to be one of the Freeway Phantom's victims. However, her case has actually been solved. In 1974, 2 men who were once District Patrol Division police officers were charged with Angela's death. Edward L. Selman was 30 years old and a salesman at the time of his arrest. Tommy B. Simmons was 26 and worked at the Thrift Loan Company. Neither had been in law enforcement long enough to complete their 1-year probation period. Simmons was on the force for a little less than a year, Selman for just 8 months. Both were convicted of Angela's murder, and prosecutors maintained that there was nothing to link the 2 to any of the other deaths. Once that potential connection to the Freeway Phantom was gone, the media stopped caring about Angela's case, and the coverage dried up. While police were investigating Angela's case, another victim had already gone missing before Angela ever left her home. Darlenia Denise Johnson left home in the morning around 10 a.m. on July 8th to go to her job at the Oxon Hill Recreation Center. Darlenia was 16 years old with arched eyebrows and a sly grin. She lived only a few blocks away from Carol. They even walked some of the same streets. Darlenia left home that morning wearing a green sweater with a blue blouse and a red, white, and blue striped miniskirt. When she didn't make it to work and didn't come home that night, her mother filed a missing persons report. Her mother waited 11 days before Darlenia was found. An employee of the then-called D.C. Department of Highways and Traffic found Darlenia. He called police to tell them that he found a dead body. He wasn't the first person to call in about Darlenia's decomposing form in a grassy area near Suitland Parkway, off the northbound lane of I-295. Police found officers who after a little while radioed in to say they hadn't found anything, but they didn't really look, they just drove by. They didn't get out of the car, she means. For reasons that escape me, they thought just driving by an area where a young, dead girl is supposed to be somewhere in the grass was sufficient enough policing for the day. What was wrong with these guys? A week later, the same employee called police again because Darlenia's body was still there. It was now July 19th in Washington, D.C. She was practically melting in the sun and heat, ruining any evidence police could hope to get from her body. I'm sorry, I'm so frustrated right now. This is why I want to talk about this case. I can't believe, we don't hear these kinds of stories. That is, if they bothered to show up and do their jobs. This time, the man made sure Darlenia's remains were taken care of. He told his boss, who told his friend, a D.C. police sergeant who, despite being off duty that day, drove out to the site to recover the dead girl. Darlenia was only about 15 feet away from where Carol's body was found. Like Carol, Darlenia was strangled, but her body was so badly decomposed that the autopsy could not determine if she had been sexually assaulted. They also couldn't even figure out who she was until they cut off her fingers to get her fingerprints. Also, like Carol, Darlenia's shoes were missing. I think it's obvious there's a connection here between these two girls. The fourth victim was Brenda Fay Crockett, the first girl in the string of murders not to have Denise in her name. Brenda was 10 years old. She was so young. In the picture of her on the Metropolitan Police Department's reward poster, she's wearing a light-colored coat, it's a black and white photograph, and a matching big bow in her hair. Her head is tilted as she smiles for the camera. She looks like she's posing on Easter Sunday. You can't see her eyes on her features very well, but she was a popular girl at her school. She liked going to church. On July 27th, Brenda's mom, Retha May Crockett, had her go to the Safeway Market to get some bread and dog food. Retha thought Brenda was going to take a friend with her. It was 8 p.m., and other kids in the neighborhood were getting ready for a movie night on the street. Brenda left home without shoes on and with foam rollers in her hair. She wasn't going far, only 5 blocks. But there's an argument that if police had made a bigger deal of the cases, if it were being publicized, if people knew that 3 other girls had been found dead in that area, maybe her mother would not have let her go at all. Unfortunately, Brenda did go to the store. Like Carol before her, she didn't come home. When Brenda didn't return, her mom and family members started looking for her and told police she was missing. Brenda's body was found around 5 a.m. the next day by a hitchhiker. She'd been strangled and sexually assaulted in the grassy shoulder of the freeway. One of the few in-depth articles of this case in the last decade is the Washington Post's, quote, 6 black girls were brutally murdered in the early 70s. Why was this case never solved? By Cheryl Thompson. That piece explains one of the startling elements of Brenda Crockett's case. She called home. Brenda's sister, Bertha, had stayed home with her mother's boyfriend while her mom and others were out looking for the girl. While they were gone, the phone rang and Bertha answered, only to hear her sister on the other end, crying. Brenda told her sister she had been snatched by a white man and she thought she was somewhere in Virginia. She said he was going to send her home in a taxi. Then she hung up. Brenda called back again about half hour later. This time she talked to Retha's boyfriend. The boyfriend tried to figure out where Brenda was in Virginia. He told her to put the man who took her on the phone. According to Thompson, quote, the boyfriend told her to put the man on the phone. Well, I'll see you, she whispered before the line went dead. Her body was found less than 8 hours later. Her bare feet were pristine, like someone had washed them. Police now had the bodies of 4 young black girls, all found along a stretch of highway, like the same stretch nonetheless, 2 with incredible similarities, and they didn't bother to raise any alarm. No one admitted that there was something rotten going on in town. The police didn't have much to help them in each individual case, and it's unclear if they were even putting it together that someone was hunting these girls. There were 2 more victims before the police decided to become more proactive about what was happening in the nation's capital. 12-year-old Nenomoshia Yates was next. Are these starting to feel like a laundry list yet? Yes. I wouldn't blame you if they are. I like the tone of this writer. I like the tone she has here. One name of a young black girl after another, thrown away like someone's garbage. But the problem is, that was all the information out there, even in the months afterward. Just names, a few details. Some black and white pictures, some slightly out of focus. They were never given histories or backstories or real identities. They were just names and faces. Nenomoshia's face was long and thin, but with cheeks that turned into little apples when she smiled. She had just a hint of a gap between her front teeth and short hair. Her family called her Neno. She loved to listen to records and was a good student, who sometimes had to be told to stop studying and go to bed. She never met her baby sister, LaShawn, who was just born when Nenomoshia was murdered. Oh, that's so sad. Nenomoshia, like Carol and Brenda, were going to the store. She'd been sent by her father on Friday, October 1st, 1971, at 7 p.m. The Safeway Market was a block away from their apartment. The family needed a few staples, sugar, paper plates, etc. Witnesses saw her in the store, and they saw her leave with her items, but no one saw her after she left the store, until a hitchhiker came across her body in a grassy spot by the freeway a few hours later. She was still warm. She'd been sexually assaulted and strangled, but police said there weren't any signs of a struggle, except for a small scratch on her forehead. Unlike Carol and Darlenia, Nenomoshia had her shoes on still. But like two of the other cases, Carol and Brenda, officers also found green synthetic fibers on her clothes. Finally, a clue. This is when law enforcement started to see connections and express them to the media. In an article for the Evening Star, Washington, D.C.'s main newspaper, Detective John Rossi told reporters, quote, "There is some reason to believe that there is some connection to some similar deaths that had occurred in the last few months," end quote. Rossi told reporters that specifically they were looking at similarities between Nenomoshia's case and Brenda Crockett's case. The article continued, quote, "Rossi indicated that since several children had been found so close to the district line, there is the possibility of a conscious attempt to take the bodies across the district line into Maryland, thereby attempting to cause interjurisdictional difficulties." But Rossi couldn't say if he thought Nenomoshia's death was part of this intricate plot. District Police also said that they had beefed up the 8-man team initially assigned to work around the clock to find Carol's killer. Prince George Police, which I think is in Maryland, who were investigating Nenomoshia's death, said they were working closely with District Police due to the similarities in the cases. Things were starting to come together, just not fast enough. At this point, even if law enforcement hadn't been completely open about their suspicions of a serial killer with the media, the community was aware that there was a problem. They had held several community meetings about the girls. The growing consensus was that the police weren't doing enough to protect their children. Nenomoshia's murder came the same day as two others. The Metropolitan Police Department Homicide Squad canceled their days off in order to try and solve their deaths. The deaths of Richie H. Reed, a 30-year-old government economist, Linda Amadown, a 47-year-old Arlington woman, turns out it was her husband who shot her in the head, but then tried to make it look like a robbery, and Nenomoshia Yates. An Evening Star front page article explained that the 3 homicides in quick succession resulted in 33 homicide officers coming in for an all-hands-on-deck situation, but with little to go on. A Star staff writer spoke to Nenomoshia's friends in the days after her abduction and murder. They told the writer that, surprisingly, aside from the shock that their friend was dead, it wasn't going to change their impression of strangers. This was one of the first pieces to use the name, quote, Freeway Phantom. Quote, "They fear strangers no more and no less than they did the day before. The strangulation of 12-year-old Nenomoshia seems to have made no great impression on them, even though they talk about the Freeway Phantom and know she is the 5th girl to die in a similar manner in the last 5 months." The disbelief and refusal to change their view of strangers seems to come more from self-preservation than anything else. It didn't seem real to them, so I guess they wanted to deny it and feel safe that way. The area was quiet for about a month and a half. Police started to think they might have leads. By October 18th, 1971, they told reporters that there was a list of several suspects in connection to Nenomoshia's murder. They were even trying to get a warrant to search a vehicle that was near where she was abducted. A friend, Jimmy, said that he saw Nenomoshia get into a blue car. Because everyone said that she wouldn't even speak to strangers, he assumed that she knew the owner of the vehicle and thought nothing of it. So there was some movement, at least on Nenomoshia's case. But police weren't saying if they'd made progress on her case in connection to the other murders, or if they were working on them separately. In fairness to police, it wasn't like these murders were the only ones they had to solve. District Police told reporters that in the city of Washington, D.C., there had been 226 murders as of mid-October 1971. There were 13 during the week of October 10th to 16th alone. When you consider that the entire homicide unit is made up of 33 detectives, that's a lot of cases to spread around. Still, it was hard for the community to not feel as though these cases were being treated differently. Brenda Denise Woodward, the oldest of all the girls, murdered at 18, disappeared on November 15th. Her parents later described her as a, quote, quiet, nice girl who wanted to be an elementary school teacher because she liked to work with kids. Although she dropped out of Spingarn High School the previous spring, she was going to Cardozo High School at night to work on her typing and shorthand skills. The night she disappeared, Brenda W. went to a Ben's Chili Bowl with a friend from the high school. Brenda and her friend, Brenda W., because there was a different Brenda. Brenda W. and her friend took the bus to their respective homes. Brenda W. got off at a stop to transfer to another bus, while her friend continued riding. He was the last person to see her alive. The next morning, around 5 a.m., a Cheverly police officer found Brenda W.'s body near Prince George's Hospital, near Route 202. She too had been sexually assaulted and strangled, but she'd also been stabbed multiple times. She was a fighter. It's possible her assailant hadn't expected her to fight so much more than the other smaller, younger girls that he had overcome before. Defensive wounds on Brenda W.'s hands showed she wasn't going down easy. Like with Nenomoshia, Brenda W.'s parents and friends said that she would never get in a car with someone she didn't know unless she was forced. Officers found a note in Brenda W.'s pocket. Written in pencil, it says, quote, "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me if you can." The letter was signed, Freeway Phantom, ! Police later said that the note was written by Brenda W. before she was murdered, and that there were other wounds on her body that indicated she had been tortured into writing it. Two things happened after Brenda W.'s murder. The media outside of D.C. started to take an interest in the case, and the police got more proactive and vocal. Finally, a search for Carol Spinks on newspapers.com, a website that has archived almost 15,000 newspapers from the 1700s to the 2000s, did not have a single news article that mentioned this Carol Spinks until a version of an Associated Press article came up. The mid-November article was reprinted in newspapers across the nation, from Washington State to Tennessee to North Carolina. Several months after Spinks was murdered was likely the first time people outside her neighborhood ever heard about what happened to her. Quote, "Carol Denise Spinks set out in the twilight of April 25th to the neighborhood grocery store on an errand for her mother and never returned. She was the first known victim of the Freeway Killer. Angela Denise Barnes was second, Darlenia Denise Johnson third, then Brenda Fay Crockett, and Nenomoshia Yates. Finally, Brenda Denise Woodard's body was found Tuesday morning beside the highway that was their common link to death. It's also possible that the Associated Press article was published because the Evening Star stopped being any form of settle. The day before, on November 17th, it published a piece by Ronald Sorrow called "The Murders. Is One Man Responsible?" That's a tough headline to beat or ignore, despite it being published at the very bottom, below the fold of the front page of the newspaper. Quote, "Young people in the near northeast and the near southeast neighborhoods talk of a single fiendish killer rapist when they talk about the slayings of 6 young black girls in the past 6 months. Sorrow started the piece. At the time, police were quietly speculating that the homicides might be linked, but there were still enough differences between the 5 murders. 6 if you include Angela Denise Barnes, whose case, at the time, still wasn't solved." I thought I had my water with me. That's okay. Oh, it was over here. Publicly, police didn't want to come out and say, "We have a serial killer on the loose." And for good reason. Number 1 being, it would incite panic and publicity that the city really didn't need. Number 2, big reason. There were still a lot of differences among the cases, to the point where it's unclear if maybe some are related and others are closer to copycats. So sick. In some cases, there were similarities among a few of the girls, like how several had Denise in their name. A few were found without their shoes, and Brenda W. and Darlenia had both worked as counselors the previous summer at a local playground. And that would make sense considering the theory that they wouldn't have talked to or gone in a car if they didn't know the person, so maybe that's how he knew them and knew their names. There were also green fibers found on some of the girls, but again, not all. This kept happening. Most of the girls were strangled, but Brenda W. was also stabbed repeatedly. In mid-November, police were moving forward on the theory that it was best to keep an open mind, that some of the cases appeared to be definitely related, but they really couldn't be too sure of anything. They didn't know if the serial killer was black or white, but when it came to any information they did have, police tended to use the "I don't know, but if I did know, I wouldn't tell you" attitude with the media. Although I think with Brenda W. or one of the other girls, the one who called, said that it was a white man, so that's my theory. Brenda W.'s murder is when the FBI got involved, and police started to ask for the public's help. Police held a press conference, and a main takeaway was that they were probably looking for one person for multiple deaths. Deputy Chief Milan Pitts was head of the Criminal Investigation Division at the time. He told reporters, quote, "We feel that because the girls are all over in this area, that somewhere in the community there are individuals or an individual who has a clue to help us in these cases." Police set up multiple tip lines at police headquarters, and they pleaded with the public to come forward with any information. They also put together a task force of 6 D.C. detectives, Prince George's County and Maryland state detectives, and FBI agents dedicated to solving the murders. Still, police kept a lot of details of the cases close in order to, quote, "weed out any crackpots," so that people couldn't falsely confess if all the clues are out there. They told people to report to law enforcement if they saw the girls around the time of their abduction, if they saw the girls being forced into a vehicle, or if they saw any suspicious activity around the time and in the areas where the girls were taken. Pitts told a reporter at the end of the day of the press conference they'd already received hundreds of calls. Within 3 days, police would say they received nearly 5,000 calls on their special phone numbers. A Capture Phantom reward fund was opened, starting with a $50 donation by the National Fraternal Order of Police Detectives and Special Police Association. According to police spokesman, "We have literally saturated the case with manpower." But in the end, it didn't matter. The case went quiet for almost a year. The holidays approached, with people apprehensive, waiting for another young body to be found along the freeway. According to the Evening Star, a little girl got on Santa's lap, surrounded by last-minute downtown Christmas shoppers, and asked, "Are you the Freeway Phantom?" Yet Christmas came and went without another dead girl on the side of the freeway. Police started to feel comfortable letting their kids walk alone. By April of 1972, the tip line had just about dried up, with calls whittled down to maybe once a week, sometimes 2 in a day. Police started to vocally question whether all the cases were really linked. I mean, they really are, my opinion. According to an Evening Star article, in conversations last week, homicide detectives in the district in Prince George's County acknowledged for the first time that little credence was ever given to speculation that a single killer was responsible for all 6 deaths. The question of how many killers they might be looking for ranged from 1 to 4. According to what the authorities were willing to share, they had 3 hairs, some semen specimens, and the note that was written by Brenda W., though law enforcement was especially skeptical of Brenda W.'s case being connected to the others. Quote, "We're pretty much convinced that the nut who did this is some clown who read about the others and got an idea," Lieutenant Albert Cool told the Evening Star. Officers also speculated about why the Phantom hadn't struck again in months. They said he was likely scared off or had been imprisoned on another charge. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case, and he would strike one more time. On September 5th, 1972, so this is like a year after the other ones, just as kids were starting to go back to school, Diane Williams went missing. Diane was 17 years old and about to be a junior at Ballou Senior High School. She wanted to be a model, with her soft features, wide, dark eyes, and a large afro. A bus driver, one of the last people to see her alive, would later tell police that he remembered Diane getting on the bus because she was so pretty. She lived in a 2-story house on a tree-lined street, and on that night she left to visit her boyfriend. It was a walk and a short bus ride that she'd made many times before over the summer. Like so many of the other girls before her, Diane's mother insisted that she just wasn't the type to get into a car with anyone she didn't know. Despite Diane's firm no strangers policy, a trucker found her body in a grassy area near Interstate 295 in Prince George's County in Maryland, close to the D.C. border, about 2 miles from her house. Diane was still wearing her yellow blouse, jeans, and white tennis shoes. She had been strangled, but there was no evidence that she'd been sexually assaulted. Aside from some bruises and scratches on her neck and scratches on her left hand, Diane looked the same as when she left home. While the 6 cases remain linked under the umbrella of the Freeway Phantom, in the few chapters, articles, and books that have been written about the case, it's impossible to say for certain if they are all linked. Not all the girls were strangled. Some were deliberately missing shoes, others weren't. I mean, Ted Bundy did different things. I just don't see why you can only connect them if they're exactly the same, you know? But that's just how I feel. Some were deliberately missing shoes, others weren't. The ages were different, although many reported that the older girls looked young for their age. Most but not all, were sexually assaulted. What does still stand out, however, is what made them similar. Young black girls, in less than 2 years, murdered and left by the side of the freeway. Carol Spinks, Darlenia Johnson, Brenda Fay Crockett, Nenomoshia Yates, Brenda Woodard, and Diane Williams are the victims that time forgot, or maybe it was never really remembered to begin with. There were some leads and hopeful suspects in the case, but none that led to anything helpful. In December of 1973, police thought that the Rochester rape slayer might be the Freeway Phantom. The Rochester cases did have some similarities, including that all the victims were young girls who had been raped and strangled. They were also found on outlying roads. However, there was a major difference. The Rochester girls were all white. I wonder if they're talking about Rochester, New York, or Rochester, Maryland. I don't know if there's a Rochester, Maryland, or Rochester, Virginia, but I wonder, because that's kind of far away. If it's in New York. Eventually, the case was rebranded as the Alphabet Killer because the first and last initial of all 3 children murdered were the same: Carmen Colon, Wanda Walkowitz, and Michelle Mayenza. There wasn't a connection, but the Alphabet Killer case was turned into a major motion picture, an exploitative, poorly written movie that took a lot of liberties and made less than $1 million gross in the US, but still. It got a movie, and the Freeway Phantom, with twice as many victims in the same time period, hasn't even gotten a halfway decent documentary film. Kind of reminds me of, I think it's called Missing White Girl Syndrome, and I think it's kind of a phenomenon in the true crime community to focus a lot more on cases that happen to young white women specifically. So clearly there's some racial bias going on. These are considered to be the first serial murder investigations in the District of Columbia. Yet aside from the family members who still mourn their losses and the detectives who worked the files or periodically look through the cold case files, their names, faces, and stories are largely forgotten. A 2018 editorial in the Washington Post, following an amazing in-depth piece on why the cases hadn't been cleared, asks the question, if the victims weren't black, would the case have been solved? Quote, if these girls had been white, they would have put more manpower on it, there's no doubt about it, said Tommy Musgrove, who joined D.C. police in 1972 and later headed homicide. He contrasted the case with that of the Lyon girls, Montgomery County girls who went missing from the Wheaton Plaza Mall in 1975 amid massive publicity, and whose murders were eventually solved in 2017 with the guilty plea of an imprisoned sex offender. It's hard to argue with officers who were on the case. In the original Cheryl Thompson article, retired DC Police Detective Romaine Jenkins recalls how she and another officer were initially sent out to help canvass the area where Carol Spinks' body was found, but a supervisor told them instead to patrol the streets and work on prison control due to the influx of war protesters. There's also the fact that Darlenia Johnson's body was left to rot in the hot summer sun because officers couldn't be bothered to get out of their car to look in the area where they were told a dead girl was lying. It just makes me furious. In 1974, another task force was created that included federal agents, Prince George's County officers, and Maryland State Police, and others. According to Jenkins, they, quote, ran down every lead, end quote, and came up with hundreds of suspects. But they never got any evidence on anyone to tie their suspects to the death of any of the girls, let alone all 6. When Jenkins was assigned to the U.S. Attorney's Office in 1987, she was allowed to reopen the case and investigate using notebooks and files from the FBI and former investigators. Jenkins later learned that the few things they could have possibly used to get DNA hadn't been properly preserved and couldn't be tested. Jenkins said mishandling of case files by DC police wasn't limited to cases where race was a factor. They would throw case files all over the place and lose evidence when a new administration took over. They just weren't equipped and organized enough for a serial murderer. While Jenkins wouldn't say that the case have gone unsolved because of race, she did say that they have never gotten the attention they deserved. Quote, "What happens when people like me and the families are gone?" Jenkins asked Thompson. "This will be forgotten." Carol Spinks, Darlenia Johnson, Brenda Fay Crockett, Nenomoshia Yates, Brenda Woodard, and Diane Williams. Let's never forget their names. Let's prove Jenkins wrong. So, quite the story. I thought it would be important to share, and I hope you were intrigued in learning about this, and hopefully we can bring more attention to cases that have been ignored throughout history, that have been temporarily forgotten. So I hope you found this interesting, and if you haven't already, please be sure to like, subscribe, and comment. I will definitely be putting out more true crime videos in the future, so if you liked this, stay tuned, and I will see you very soon in my next video. Bye bye.